The bells of St. Peter's Square rang softly that morning, their echoes traveling through the narrow streets of Rome. Inside the Vatican, a gentle hum filled the air, footsteps whispered prayers, and the faint sound of music drifting from the rehearsal hall. It was the week before Easter, and the city was alive with visitors, pilgrims, and choirs from across the world. But this year, there was one guest who had captured everyone's attention, a pianist whose name was known far beyond Italy. His name was Vittorio Salvi. He was young, handsome, and immensely talented, a man whose fingers could bring an audience to tears. People said he could make a piano sound like it was breathing, like it had a soul of its own. He had played in the grandest halls of Europe, from Paris to Vienna, and critics called him the modern genius of melody. But behind his fame, Vittorio carried something heavier than pride, a deep hunger to be seen as the best, even above others who had taught or praised him. When the invitation came from the Vatican, Vittorio didn't see it as a spiritual honor. He saw it as a stage, a place where even the Pope would hear his greatness. His manager had told him that this year's Easter gathering was going to be broadcast across several countries. "You'll be performing before the Holy Father himself," the man had said proudly. "Every note you play will be remembered." Vittorio smiled at that thought. He imagined the faces of the priests, the cardinals, the choir, and even the Pope, listening, astonished by his art. He pictured applause, admiration, and stories written about him the next day. "Yes," he had said quietly, "I'll make them remember." The morning he arrived at the Vatican, the staff welcomed him politely, but not with the excitement he was used to. There were no photographers, no screaming admirers, only calm faces and quiet words. The place itself was different from the luxury theaters he knew. The walls were filled with paintings of saints and angels. The air smelled of candles and old wood. Everything seemed to breathe humility, and for a man like Vittorio, that was almost uncomfortable. A priest led him to the rehearsal hall where the Vatican choir was practicing. Their voices filled the space with a kind of beauty Vittorio hadn't heard before. Not perfect, not polished, but full of devotion. Each singer looked focused, their eyes lifted slightly as if they were singing not for the audience but for something higher. Vittorio set down his coat, placed his hands on the piano, and began to play a few test notes. The sound bounced softly through the hall and the choir stopped singing to listen. His touch was precise, his expression proud. The choir members exchanged small glances. Some whispered to each other. They had heard about him, but seeing him in person was something else. Moments later, an elderly man entered quietly from the far end of the hall. His steps were slow, but his presence made everyone rise to their feet. It was Pope Leo XIII. He was dressed simply, his white robes glowing faintly in the golden light. His eyes were gentle, and though age had lined his face, there was kindness in his smile. "Maestro Salvi," the Pope greeted softly. "Thank you for joining us. We are honored." Vittorio bowed respectfully, though his heart swelled with pride at the word honored. "Your Holiness," he said, "the honor is mine." The Pope looked at the piano, then at the choir. "We have a special hymn this year, something that celebrates both joy and peace. I understand you will be performing a solo before the choir joins in?" "Yes," Vittorio replied. "I have prepared an original composition. It will introduce the hymn with a new kind of feeling, one that reaches the soul." The Pope smiled faintly. "Music always reaches the soul, Maestro, but only if the heart behind it is humble." Vittorio wasn't sure how to take those words. He simply nodded and sat back down at the piano. The rehearsal began. Vittorio's fingers danced across the keys with energy and grace. Every note sparkled. The choir followed after him, but something in their rhythm didn't match the tempo he was playing. They struggled slightly to keep up. After a few minutes, Pope Leo raised his hand gently. The music stopped. "Beautiful," the Pope said kindly. "But perhaps, Maestro, if the introduction were played just a little softer, the voices of the choir could blend more naturally. It would help them lift their harmony." Vittorio froze. For a moment he didn't believe what he'd heard. No one had ever suggested changing his music, not a single critic or conductor. He looked up slowly, his pride rising like heat. "Softer?" he repeated, his tone polite but tight. "Your Holiness, the introduction is meant to be powerful. It captures the grandeur of the moment, If I play softly, it will lose its strength. The Pope didn't seem offended. Power can come from gentleness too, he said softly. Sometimes the heart hears more in silence than in thunder. A few members of the choir looked at the Pope with quiet admiration. Vittorio's jaw tightened. He turned to the piano again. "As you wish," he said, but there was a sharpness in his voice. He played the section again, deliberately forceful. The sound echoed hard against the marble walls. It was breathtaking, yes, but it drowned out the choir completely. When they finished, a heavy silence filled the room. The choir members lowered their eyes. No one wanted to speak. The Pope smiled faintly again, not with anger, but with a kind of sorrow. "Thank you, Maestro," he said. "Perhaps we shall try again tomorrow." Vittorio stood quickly. "Perhaps the choir should practice their timing," he said under his breath, not realizing the room had gone completely silent. The words had slipped out louder than he meant. A few singers gasped. One of them dropped her sheet of music. The Pope heard him clearly. But instead of correcting or reprimanding him, he simply nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "We all have something to learn." Then he turned and walked out of the hall. Vittorio felt every eye on him. He could sense the disappointment, the judgment. He tried to hide his irritation by adjusting his cuffs, pretending it didn't matter. "We'll rehearse again tomorrow," he said, forcing a smile. "You'll see. It will sound magnificent." But when he left the hall, his steps were faster than usual. He told himself he didn't care, that the Pope's opinion couldn't change his music. Yet deep down, a small voice inside him whispered that he had crossed a line he couldn't quite see. That night, Vittorio stayed in the guest quarters provided for him near the Vatican Gardens. From his window, he could see the dome of St. Peter's Basilica glowing against the evening sky. He sat at a small piano and played softly to himself, but the music didn't feel the same. The sound seemed empty. He remembered the Pope's words. Power can come from gentleness too. He tried playing the introduction softer, just as the Pope had suggested. The melody changed. It didn't lose strength, it gained warmth. It was as if the music had taken a breath. Vittorio stopped suddenly, confused by the feeling. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was the master of the music or if the music was trying to teach him something. The next morning, as the sun rose over the Vatican, the choir gathered again. They were nervous, unsure if the Pope would return after what had happened. But when he entered the hall, he smiled at each of them as though nothing had gone wrong. He spoke gently, giving encouragement, praising their effort. When he approached Vittorio, he said simply, "Let's begin again, Maestro. Today is a new day." There was no trace of anger, no pride, no coldness in his tone. It was pure calm. Vittorio felt something shift in his chest, something he couldn't explain. He nodded silently, sat at the piano, and began to play again. The choir followed. The sound this time was softer, smoother, and when the Pope closed his eyes, he smiled faintly. For a brief moment, everything felt right, but Vittorio's pride, though weakened, was not gone. Deep inside, he was still thinking, "They need me to make this perfect," and somewhere in that thought, the quiet storm of what would come next began to grow, slowly, silently, waiting for the moment when pride would meet humility face to face. The next few days moved slowly inside the Vatican. The choir practiced every morning, their voices blending gently through the large hall, while Vittorio spent most of his time at the piano, refining each note. Though he acted confident, inside he was uneasy. The Pope's calmness from the day before lingered in his thoughts. It wasn't anger that had unsettled him. It was how the Pope's kindness made his own pride look small. Every time he sat down to play, he could feel the eyes of the choir on him. Some looked nervous, others curious, but none dared to speak much to him. They respected his talent, but his attitude had created a distance. Only one of the senior choir members, an older man with gray hair, tried to keep the peace. "Maestro," he said kindly one morning, "the music sounds beautiful when we follow your lead. Perhaps today we can find the right balance between strength and softness." Vittorio smiled politely, but inside he felt irritated. "Balance," he thought. "They speak of balance as if I don't understand music." He nodded and sat down. The rehearsal began again, and as usual, the piano filled the room with a grand, rich sound. When they reached the middle of the hymn, Pope Leo XIV entered quietly from the back. His presence was calm, almost unnoticed at first, but soon everyone saw him and stopped singing. He motioned for them to continue. "Please," he said gently, "I am only here to listen." Vittorio's fingers moved faster now. His performance became more dramatic, filled with flourishes and powerful runs. He wanted to prove his skill, to show that he was more than just an accompanist or the choir. The Pope closed his eyes, listening carefully. When the song ended, there was silence again. "That was strong," the Pope said softly. "Very strong." Then, after a short pause, he added, "Perhaps, Maestro, if we listen to what the music wants to say rather than what we want to show, it might speak to us more deeply." The words felt like a soft wind cutting through stone. Vittorio straightened his back and forced a smile. "I believe, Your Holiness, that music must impress the listener," he replied. "People must feel its power. Otherwise it becomes plain." The Pope looked at him for a long moment, his expression still calm. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "what moves the heart most is not power but peace." The choir members remained silent. A few lowered their heads. Vittorio looked down at the piano, pretending to adjust his sheet music, but his hands were trembling slightly. He felt exposed, almost as if the Pope had seen through his pride. When the rehearsal ended, Vittorio packed up quickly. He walked out into the courtyard, the sound of bells echoing in the distance. The sun was shining on the cobblestones, and tourists were walking nearby, laughing and taking pictures. But he felt none of their joy. He sat down on a bench near a small fountain, staring at the water as it rippled. He remembered his first concert when he was 17. Back then he played with pure love for the piano, not for fame. He could recall how happy he felt just to hear the melody come alive. But over the years, praise and applause had changed something in him. Now when he played, he thought of how people looked at him, not how the music made them feel. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, a messenger came to his quarters with a note written on elegant parchment. It was from the Pope's secretary. The message was short. "His Holiness requests your presence tomorrow morning in the small chapel for a private rehearsal." Vittorio felt his chest tighten. A private rehearsal? He didn't know whether it was a good sign or a punishment. He barely slept that night, his mind replaying every word he had said, every look the Pope had given him. When morning came, he dressed neatly and walked to the chapel. It was much smaller than the grand hall, simple walls, soft light, and the faint scent of incense in the air. The Pope was already there, sitting quietly near the altar. "Good morning, Maestro," the Pope greeted him warmly. "Thank you for coming." Vittorio bowed. "Good morning, Your Holiness." The Pope gestured toward the piano. "Please," he said, "let us play together. I do not sing well, but I wish to feel the music closely." Vittorio hesitated, then nodded. He sat down and began playing a gentle melody, something slow and beautiful. The Pope hummed softly, his voice low but steady. It wasn't perfect, but there was sincerity in every note. Vittorio felt something unusual as he played. It wasn't competition, it wasn't performance, it was harmony. When the song ended, the Pope looked at him kindly. "Do you hear it now?" he asked. "Hear what?" Vittorio said softly. "The space between the notes," the Pope replied. "That is where the soul lives." Vittorio didn't know how to respond. He looked at the keys, then at the Pope. For a brief moment he felt a flicker of humility, almost gratitude. But before he could speak, a member of the Vatican staff entered and reminded them about the next public rehearsal that afternoon. The moment faded and Vittorio stood up quickly. "Thank you, Your Holiness," he said, forcing composure. "I will do my best," the Pope smiled. "That is all any of us can do." By afternoon, the main hall was filled again. The choir was in place, the priests and guests seated quietly. Vittorio took his position at the piano, his expression serious. The air was thick with tension. Everyone could feel it. The Pope sat among the listeners, hands folded in prayer. As the rehearsal began, Vittorio's playing was perfect, technically flawless. Every note sparkled, but when the choir entered, something happened. Their voices carried emotion that his music didn't match. They sang with feeling while he played with control. The difference was clear. Halfway through the piece, the Pope gently raised his hand again. The choir stopped, the piano faded, and silence filled the room. Vittorio turned, unsure what was happening. "Maestro," the Pope said softly, "the choir is struggling to follow your tempo. Could you give them space to breathe between the phrases?" Vittorio's pride finally broke through. "Your Holiness," he said, his voice rising slightly, With all respect, I am playing the music as it should be played. If they cannot follow, perhaps they are not ready for this level of performance." A soft murmur spread across the room. The choir members looked shocked, and even some priests exchanged uneasy glances. The Pope looked at him quietly. His eyes showed no anger, only sadness. "Perhaps you are right," the Pope said gently. "Perhaps we are not ready for such greatness." Vittorio realized too late how harsh his words had sounded. The silence that followed was heavy. One of the younger choir members had tears in her eyes, embarrassed and hurt. The atmosphere in the room felt broken, but the Pope stood slowly, still calm. "Let us take a short pause," he said kindly. "Sometimes the heart needs rest before the voice can sing again." He turned and walked out quietly. No one moved for a few seconds. Then, one by one, the choir members began gathering their sheets in silence. Vittorio sat frozen at the piano, staring at the keys. The sound of his earlier words echoed in his mind. That night, the Vatican corridors felt emptier than usual. Vittorio walked alone toward the gardens. He could hear the faint chanting of monks in the distance. He sat under an olive tree thinking about what had happened. He had come to impress the Pope, to leave his mark in history, and instead, he had humiliated himself before everyone. He replayed the moment in his mind, the Pope's quiet expression, the choir's silence, the weight of his own pride. He felt anger at first, then shame. Why couldn't he just stay silent? Vittorio whispered to himself. But deep down he knew the real question was, why couldn't I? Hours passed before he finally returned to his room. He sat at the piano again, playing softly, letting the notes drift into the empty night. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his music. It was fragile, hesitant, like an apology that couldn't yet be spoken. Outside, the bells began to ring for evening prayer. Their sound echoed gently through the courtyard, reminding him of something the Pope had said. Sometimes the heart hears more in silence than in thunder. He stopped playing, closed his eyes, and sat in stillness. The world around him seemed to quiet itself, and for the first time in many years, Vittorio began to feel the weight of his own noise, and though no one saw it, that night a small tear rolled down his cheek, a tear not of sadness, but of awakening. The morning of the Easter concert came faster than anyone expected. The Vatican was alive with quiet movement. Candles were being lit, flowers placed carefully along the marble steps, and the choir prepared in the great hall where sunlight streamed through high stained glass windows. The air was filled with nervous energy, yet there was peace in it too, peace that came from faith, not performance. But for Vittorio, peace was hard to find. He had barely slept. His mind was full of unfinished thoughts, words he wished he had not said, and the memory of the Pope's calm face when he had spoken so harshly. He looked at himself in the mirror that morning and saw not the proud genius the world adored, but a tired man unsure of what he truly stood for. Still, he dressed with care, wearing his best black suit. When he walked toward the great hall, every step echoed softly on the marble floor. The sound reminded him of the piano, each step like a quiet note in an unfinished song. When he entered the hall, the choir members were already gathered. Their robes were white, their faces filled with concentration and reverence. He could feel their unease when he appeared, but no one spoke a word. The air was heavy with what had happened days before. The Pope had not yet arrived. Vittorio sat down at the piano, opened his sheet music, and began to warm up his hands. The instrument sounded beautiful, but inside he felt empty. He pressed the keys lightly, listening to the echo of each note fade into silence. For a moment he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then the great doors opened quietly. Everyone turned. Pope Leo XIV entered, walking slowly, supported slightly by one of his aides. Despite his age, there was strength in his step and kindness in his eyes. The choir bowed their heads as he passed. Vittorio stood respectfully, unsure what to expect. The Pope smiled gently at everyone. "Today," he said, his voice calm and clear, "we give music back to the heavens. Let every note be a prayer, not a performance." He looked at Vittorio as he said those words, but not with accusation, only warmth. Vittorio nodded silently and sat down at the piano again. The hall was soon filled with guests, cardinals, priests, nuns, and visitors from many countries. The light through the stained glass danced across the walls in soft colors of blue, gold, and crimson. When the Pope took his seat, the entire hall fell into reverent silence. The signal was given. Vittorio began to play, The first notes rose gently through the air, smooth and graceful. His fingers moved with control, but his heart was uneasy. He could feel hundreds of eyes watching him, yet it was the Pope's calm gaze that stayed in his mind. The melody grew louder, stronger, too strong. His pride slipped back in without warning, turning the music into a show of power rather than peace. When the choir entered, their voices were soft, almost trembling. They tried to match his tempo, but it was difficult. He was playing too fast, too loud. The balance was gone again. He could feel the tension rising, but his pride refused to let him stop. Then, in the middle of the piece, something unexpected happened. The Pope stood up. At first, no one understood what he was doing. The choir faltered, and Vittorio's hands froze above the keys. The Pope stepped slowly toward the center of the hall and turned to face the choir. His voice was calm as ever. "My children," he said softly, "let us remember why we sing." Then he did something that no one could have predicted. He walked toward the choir, stood among them, and gestured for the music to begin again. The hall was silent except for the soft rustle of robes. Vittorio stared, unsure what to do. The Pope looked at him and smiled gently. "Play, maestro," he said. "Let us begin together." Vittorio's heart pounded. He pressed his fingers on the keys, but this time, the sound that came out was different. It was quieter, humbler, almost fragile. The Pope began to sing with the choir, his voice not perfect but full of emotion. The singers followed him, and soon their harmony filled the hall with a kind of warmth that no piano could overpower. For the first time, Vittorio stopped thinking about himself. He listened. He slowed down his playing, shaping the notes to fit the rhythm of their voices. The music changed. It was no longer a performance but a shared prayer. The Pope's voice trembled slightly, but the sincerity in it touched everyone. Even the listeners who had come expecting grand music now sat still, tears welling in their eyes. The choir's voices rose higher, and the piano became a soft foundation beneath them. Vittorio felt something breaking open inside him, a wall that had stood for too long. As the song went on, he stopped playing with pride and started playing with feeling. Every note was an apology, every chord a confession. He wasn't trying to impress anymore. He was trying to connect. When the last verse came, the Pope lifted his head, his eyes closed, and sang with quiet power. The choir's harmony surrounded him, and Vittorio's piano followed as if guided by something beyond him. The final notes faded into a silence that felt sacred. No one moved. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Vittorio's hands rested on the keys, trembling slightly. He looked up and saw the Pope still standing among the singers, his face peaceful, eyes still closed. Then the Pope turned slowly and looked at him. His smile was gentle. "That," he said softly, "was music." The choir was silent, many of them with tears on their faces. Some of the guests in the audience bowed their heads in quiet awe. Vittorio felt his throat tighten. He stood unsure what to do. For the first time in his life, he felt small, but in a good way. Not defeated, but humbled. The Pope stepped forward and placed his hand on the piano. "Thank you, maestro," he said. "You have given us beauty, and beauty shared is never lost." Those words hit deeper than any applause. Vittorio bowed his head, unable to speak. The hall remained still for a few seconds more before the sound of gentle clapping began. Not loud, not showy, but full of respect. Afterward, when everyone left the hall, Vittorio stayed behind. The sunlight had shifted, painting the floor in soft gold. The piano stood quiet before him. He touched the keys gently, letting out a deep breath. The echoes of the song still floated in the air, as if the walls themselves remembered. The Pope's voice replayed in his mind. Music without humility is only noise. He finally understood what those words meant. For so long he had tried to be heard by the world, but he had never really listened, to others or to his own heart. He sat at the piano again, playing softly. This time the music was simple, just a quiet melody that felt like gratitude. He wasn't thinking about audiences, critics, or fame. He was thinking of the moment when the Pope had sung beside him, not above him. As he played, one of the choir members walked back into the hall. She had stayed behind to collect her sheet music, but when she heard the piano, she stopped at the door. She listened quietly, smiling through tears. The melody was gentle, full of peace. When Vittorio finished, she approached and said softly, "That sounded beautiful, Maestro." He smiled faintly. "Not Maestro," he said. "Just Vittorio," she nodded. "Then it's good to meet you, just Vittorio." He laughed quietly, the first real laugh he had felt in a long time. There was no pride in it, only relief. For the first time, he felt light. That evening, during the final gathering in the courtyard, Pope Leo XIV walked by where Vittorio was standing. The Pope paused, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You played with your heart today," he said. "Remember, the world does not need more perfect musicians. It needs honest ones." Vittorio nodded slowly, emotion in his eyes. "Thank you, Your Holiness. I will remember." The Pope smiled and continued walking, speaking kindly to others as he went. Vittorio watched him go, feeling something inside him change forever. The bells of St. Peter's began to ring again, their sound rising into the evening sky. The crowd slowly dispersed, laughter and conversation filling the courtyard. But Vittorio remained where he was, looking up at the fading light above the Vatican dome. He realized then that the music he had been searching for all his life wasn't in his hands. It was in moments like this, where pride fell silent and truth spoke quietly. He closed his eyes and whispered a small prayer of thanks. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to prove anything. He was simply grateful to have played, to have learned, and to have been forgiven without a single word of blame. The next morning, when he left the Vatican, the streets of Rome were still waking up. Vendors were setting out flowers, children were laughing, and the sound of church bells echoed across the rooftops. Vittorio carried no trophies, no applause, only a peace that felt new and real. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this was the beginning of a different kind of music, one that didn't demand to be heard, only to be felt. The morning after the concert, the Vatican was quieter than usual. The great bells that had filled the city with sound now rang softly in the distance, marking a new day. The air carried the smell of rain from the night before, and the stone paths glistened under the soft light of dawn. Vittorio walked alone through the courtyard. He wasn't rushing anywhere. He simply walked, his hands behind his back, lost in thought. Every few steps he looked around, taking in the beauty he had never really noticed before. The old fountain in the corner, the ivy climbing the walls, the way sunlight touched the statues of saints. For the first time, he wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for peace. He had been invited to stay for a few more days by the Pope's secretary. "His Holiness wishes to speak with you before you leave," the note had said. The message didn't say why, but Vittorio didn't mind. He was curious, and in some quiet way, he felt grateful for the chance. Later that morning, the choir gathered again, not for rehearsal, but to offer a small prayer of thanks. Vittorio joined them quietly, sitting in the last row. He listened to their voices rise softly, filling the chapel with warmth. No one treated him like a celebrity anymore, and that oddly felt comforting. He wasn't the center of attention. He was simply part of something bigger than himself. When the prayer ended, one of the choir members approached him with a smile. "You're playing yesterday," she said softly. "It felt like we were all breathing together." "Thank you." Vittorio nodded, humbled. "No," he replied, "thank you. You reminded me what music really means." After the service, he walked toward the garden behind the chapel. There, under an old olive tree, he found Pope Leo XIV sitting quietly on a wooden bench reading a small book. When the Pope looked up and saw him, his face lit up with a gentle smile. "Ah, Maestro," he said kindly. "You came." Vittorio bowed slightly. "Your Holiness, I wanted to thank you for everything." The Pope closed the book and placed it beside him. "Come sit," he said, patting the bench. "The gardens are beautiful this time of day. Even the flowers seem to pray." Vittorio sat down. For a while, neither spoke. The birds sang softly in the trees, and the sound of a nearby fountain filled the silence. The Pope finally said, "I saw your eyes yesterday when the music ended. You found something, didn't you?" Vittorio nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Holiness. I think I did. For the first time, I wasn't playing for myself. I was listening." The Pope smiled gently. "That is the beginning of true art. To listen before you play. To feel before you speak." He paused, then added, "Many people think humility means weakness, but humility is strength. It allows the heart to grow." Vittorio lowered his eyes. "I think I understand that now. But I also feel ashamed. I spoke out of pride. I insulted people who were only trying to make music with me. I don't know if they can forgive me. The Pope leaned back, his gaze soft. You already began to ask for forgiveness the moment you realized your mistake. The rest will come naturally. He turned to face Vittorio. Tell me, Maestro, when did music stop being joy for you? The question surprised him. He thought for a moment. Maybe when I started caring more about applause than the melody. I wanted the world to notice me so much that I forgot why I started playing. I used to play for my mother when I was a child. She would close her eyes and smile. That was enough then. But somewhere along the way I wanted more. The Pope nodded. Fame is a beautiful trap. It shines bright, but it blinds us to what matters most. They sat in silence again for a few minutes. The wind moved gently through the garden, rustling the leaves. Then the Pope said softly, Do you know why I love music, Maestro? Vittorio looked at him curiously. Why, Your Holiness? Because music is like faith, the Pope said. It is invisible, yet it changes everything it touches. It can lift the broken, soften the proud, and remind us of beauty even in sorrow. That is why it must come from the heart, not the ego. Those words settled deeply in Vittorio's chest. He wanted to remember them forever. The Pope stood slowly, steadying himself on his cane. I have one request, he said with a small smile. Tomorrow morning, before you leave Rome, would you play one more piece for the choir? Something of your choosing. Vittorio's eyes widened slightly. Of course, Your Holiness. It would be my honor, the Pope nodded. Play it not for us, but for the one who gave you the gift. That night, Vittorio sat at the piano in his room, staring at the keys. He didn't have any sheet music before him. He wanted the melody to come from within. Slowly, his fingers began to move, softly at first, then with growing confidence. The tune that formed was gentle, full of warmth and peace. It wasn't grand or complex, it was honest. He played for hours, letting the music speak what words couldn't. Every note carried a piece of his journey, his pride, his mistakes, his awakening. When he finished, he smiled quietly to himself. It felt right. The next morning, the choir gathered again, curious about the Pope's special request. Vittorio sat at the piano, his expression calm. The Pope entered, greeted everyone, and sat quietly in the front row. Today, he said softly, we listen not with our ears, but with our hearts. Vittorio nodded, took a deep breath, and began to play. The melody was slow, tender, and pure. It floated through the chapel like a gentle prayer. The choir listened silently, and even the guards near the door stood still, moved by the sound. There was no showing off, no loud moments, no dramatic flair. It was just truth, spoken through music. As he played, Vittorio thought of everything he had learned in those few days. He thought of the Pope's words, of the choir's patience, of the silence that had once made him uncomfortable but now felt sacred. He poured all of it into the song. When the final note faded, the room stayed silent. No one clapped. They didn't need to. The silence itself was the highest form of respect. The Pope stood slowly, his eyes moist with emotion. Thank you, Maestro, he said softly. That was not just music. That was prayer. Vittorio bowed his head deeply. It was all I had to give, he replied. The Pope stepped closer and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. And that is enough. The rest of the day passed quietly. Vittorio spent a few hours walking through Rome before returning to his hotel. The city felt different now, less like a stage, more like a living symphony. He noticed the laughter of children, the voices of street musicians, the soft sound of church bells echoing through the alleys. Everything felt alive. That evening, he wrote a letter to the Pope, thanking him for the lesson he would never forget. He ended it with a simple line. You taught me that silence can be the most beautiful note of all. The next morning, before leaving the city, he placed the letter at the Vatican gate. Then he turned, carrying nothing but his music and a newfound peace. Years later, when people spoke of the great pianist Vittorio Salvi, they said his music had changed. It was still beautiful, but now it carried something deeper, something that reached people's hearts. He never spoke much about what happened in the Vatican, but every Easter, wherever he was in the world, he would play the same gentle melody he had played for the Pope that morning. He would close his eyes, let the sound fill the air and whisper softly, for you. And those who listened, even without knowing the story, felt something unexplainable in that music. Something honest, something humble, something divine. Years passed like pages turning in a quiet book. The world moved on. New faces rose in the music world, new stages lit up with younger talents. But somewhere across different cities and small concert halls, the name Vittorio Salvi still carried a soft reverence. He was no longer the fiery pianist known for his proud temperament. He had become something different, something gentler, almost mysterious. Those who heard him in later years always said the same thing. His playing felt like a conversation with the soul. Vittorio didn't chase fame anymore. He still performed, but his concerts were smaller, quieter, more personal. He preferred old theaters and churches, places where the sound could breathe and linger in the air. He spoke little before or after playing, but those who met him said his silence spoke louder than words. One winter evening, Vittorio returned to his hometown, a small coastal village where the streets were narrow and the air smelled faintly of the sea. He hadn't been there in decades. The people still remembered him, the boy who used to play piano in the church while his mother sat in the front row, eyes closed, smiling. When he walked into the old church, now a little worn with age, he found the same piano still standing near the altar. Its surface was scratched, its keys a little yellowed. But when he pressed a note, the sound was warm and kind, like an old friend welcoming him home. He sat there for a long time, remembering. The echoes of his childhood felt close again. The laughter, the small mistakes, his mother's proud eyes. It was all there, hidden in the dust and the sound of those familiar keys. The local priest entered quietly and smiled when he saw him. "It's been a long time, maestro," he said softly. Vittorio smiled. "Too long," he replied. "But this place hasn't changed much," the priest chuckled. "Neither have you. Maybe a few more gray hairs, but the same heart, I think." Vittorio looked down at his hands. "The same heart," he said gently, "but a little wiser, I hope." The priest nodded. "Would you play something for us this Sunday? The people would love it. They remember your mother, too." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I would like that." That Sunday morning, the small church was filled beyond its walls. Old friends, children, neighbors, they all came, whispering with excitement. Some brought flowers, others came just to listen. When Vittorio walked in, the room went silent. He wore no grand suit, no medals or ribbons, just a simple black coat. He sat at the piano and took a deep breath. Before he began, he looked at the people and said softly, "This music is for my mother, and for all of you who never forgot me." Then he began to play. The melody that flowed from his hands was tender and filled with warmth. It was the same piece he had played years ago for Pope Leo XIV, the same one that had changed his heart. But this time it felt even more personal. Every note carried memories, forgiveness, and gratitude. The people listened in complete stillness, many with tears in their eyes. When the final note faded, Vittorio lifted his hands slowly from the keys. The silence that followed was deep and peaceful. Then, as if moved by the same heartbeat, the whole church stood and applauded, not wildly, but with deep respect. After the service, many people came to him. They didn't speak much. Most just held his hand, smiled, or nodded quietly. Vittorio felt something he hadn't felt in years, a pure connection with others, the same kind of connection the Pope had once spoken about. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Vittorio sat on a bench outside the church watching the sea. The waves rolled gently against the shore, and a soft wind played with his hair. He felt calm, completely at peace. He took out a small notebook he always carried with him. Inside were small sketches of melodies, little pieces he had written in different cities over the years. On one blank page he wrote, "Music is not about being heard. It is about being understood." He closed the notebook and smiled. A few months later, an unexpected letter arrived for him. It came from the Vatican. The handwriting was elegant and familiar. It was from the Pope's secretary. The letter read, "Dear Maestro, His Holiness Pope Leo XIV often speaks of the pianist who taught him that humility can be heard in music. The Pope's health is now fragile, but he still remembers you with great affection. He listens to your recordings often, especially the one from your last concert in Rome. He says it reminds him that grace can be found in silence." Vittorio read the letter slowly, touched beyond words. He decided to return to Rome one last time. When he arrived, the Vatican looked the same as it had years ago, though he himself was older now, his hair silver, his steps slower. The guards greeted him warmly. Some even recognized him. He was escorted through the grand halls where the sunlight streamed through the stained glass and painted the floor in colors of gold and blue. The Pope was resting in his private garden. He was frailer now, his movements slower, but his eyes were still bright with the same kindness Vittorio remembered. When he saw the pianist, his face lit up with joy. "My dear maestro," he said, his voice gentle but warm. "You came back." Vittorio bowed deeply. "I had to, Your Holiness. I wanted to thank you for changing my life." The Pope smiled softly. "Ah, no, you changed your own heart. I merely watched." They sat together again under the same olive tree where they had once spoken. The garden was quiet. The same fountain still murmured nearby. For a while, they simply enjoyed the silence, as if words would have only broken the peace between them. Finally, the Pope said, "Do you still play that melody you played for us long ago?" Vittorio nodded. "Every Easter. It reminds me that music is prayer." The Pope's eyes glistened. "Then play it for me one last time." A small piano had been brought into the garden for special occasions. Vittorio sat at it, his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear but from age. When he began to play, the same soft melody floated through the air. The Pope closed his eyes. The sound was simple, pure, full of life. It carried memories of everything: the humiliation, the forgiveness, the change, the peace. When the final note faded, the Pope whispered, "Beautiful. You have turned humility into music," Vittorio smiled gently, "and you taught me that the heart is the greatest instrument of all." They sat together until the sun began to set. The light turned golden, casting long shadows across the garden. When they finally parted, the Pope blessed him softly. "May your music never fall silent, maestro." Vittorio left Rome the next morning. He didn't know it then, but it would be his last journey there. A few months later, the world received the news that Pope Leo XIV had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The message spread everywhere. People remembered him as a kind and humble leader who had touched hearts across the world. Vittorio felt the loss deeply. That evening, he sat at his piano and played the same melody once more. This time, tears filled his eyes as he played. The music was both farewell and gratitude. Years later, when Vittorio himself passed away, his small home by the sea was filled with sheet music and letters. On his piano stood a single framed photo, a picture of him with Pope Leo XIV, sitting together under the olive tree, both smiling. At his funeral, the villagers gathered in the same old church. The priest, now older himself, stood before the crowd and said, "He gave the world music that could heal the soul." The choir, which had once been filled with children who admired him, sang softly. Then one of his students sat at the piano and played the same melody that Vittorio had played all those years ago. The sound filled the church, and for a moment, everyone felt as if he were there with them, smiling. As the last note lingered in the air, sunlight broke through the stained glass window and fell on the piano keys, bathing them in gold. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence said everything, and somewhere beyond sound and time, it was said that Vittorio and the Pope were reunited, two souls who had once been humbled by music and healed by grace. The melody that began in pride had ended in peace, and the silence that followed was more beautiful than any song.